Following the collapse of the Institute at the hands of the Minutemen, the idea of a new provisional Commonwealth government was proposed. Approved and backed by the leaders of the three major cities in the region, as well as several other settlements, the government began to take shape.
Of the people, for the people.
The Brotherhood of Steel gave its tepid support to the formation of a new government for the region. They would not, however, directly support or contribute to the government, but instead took on an advisory role. Because of the lack of an organized security force, the Commonwealth was wide open to attack by raiders, super mutants, and mercenary groups. The biggest security problem at this time was the mercenary company known as the Gunners. The Gunner Company had appeared in the Commonwealth region several years earlier. The mercenaries made themselves notorious for the brutal tactics that they employed, and a reputation for taking anything of value with little regard to the damage that they caused, or casualties that they inflicted. Even with a distinct advantage in numbers, the fight for the medical complex became a brutal room-to-room struggle with the entrenched Gunner troops. The Minutemen took several casualties but slowly trapped the garrison in a small pocket on the upper floors. Finally, as the sun was setting, the Gunners were forced out onto a rooftop patio. The remaining troopers began to surrender, but rather than give up, the Gunner commander opted to jump to his death below. The 13th, the artillery barrage was lifted, and storming parties went in to clear out the remaining defenders. Fierce room-to-room fighting took place for most of the afternoon. Late in the day the remaining gunners finally began surrendering. A party of Minutemen raised the Minutemen flag over the building that evening. The Commonwealth of today is a great nation. But it wasn't always so. The early Commonwealth had to be built up from the desolate nuclear wasteland of the past, and taken away from the barbarians that ruled it. The leaders of some of the largest raider bands in the Commonwealth did not welcome the news. James Wire, leader of the Libertalia Raiders, sent envoys to the largest raider bands in the Commonwealth to meet and discuss this development. They agreed to meet in Kendall Hospital on the night of the 29th of January. Ivy from the Rust Devils, Bosco from DB Technical, Jared from the Corvega factory, and Judge Zeller from Zeller's army came along with leaders from several of the smaller bands. The desperate raiders turned the buildings of the city into armored fortresses. The subsequent Battle of Lexington saw some of the heaviest and most brutal street fighting of the entire war. In some cases, the coalition had to physically collapse the buildings rather than take them in order to clear out the raiders inside. Raised over the mountain. Most of the 13th was wounded or dead. Captain Dancer lay propped up against a wall and greeted Colonel Garvey. He reported mission accomplished just before dying. Colonel Garvey had him buried on the mountain top with full military honors. And so, Captain John Dancer, formerly known as Paladin Dance, of the Brotherhood of Steel, was laid to rest. Just after 2 a.m., the task force passed the MS Azalea and Huntress Island with no challenge. Things changed as they approached Cranberry Island. A signal light flashed out a challenge, and when it was not answered, a siren began to wail. Soon signal flares lit up the outer harbor. Gunfire erupted from the positions on Cranberry Island, Northwood Quarry, Vim Factory, and from Southwest Harbor. The task force turned sharply north towards the Southwest Harbor docks. The raiding force huddled under cover till the ships touched the docks and then sprang up to climb the hillside. A murderous crossfire from automated turrets cut down the first few Marines. Slowly but surely the Minutemen gained a tenuous foothold on the southern end of the town. After the Minutemen had offloaded, the boat crews steered towards the mouth of the harbor. One sailor on each boat returning fire with a heavy machine gun while the other two worked the boat. The lead boat, Iris, took the brunt of the enemy fire and began sinking low in the water. Thistle moved up and took over the lead, followed by Naiad. Thistle reached the eastern end of the harbor mouth and the crew dropped at anchor and set the timed explosives before jumping overboard. Naiad followed suit. The crew on the Iris threw a rope to Naiad and slowly pulled their boat into position just behind Naiad. As they were leaving the boat, Petty Officer Akinyemi noticed trappers boarding the Thistle to steer it out of the way. He turned back to fire at them. The rest of the crew of the Iris came back to help him. 5 minutes later the scuttling charges went off. The three vessels settled to the bottom of the harbor entrance, blocking the trapper fleet access to the sea. The crew of the Iris died defending their ship. The remaining sailors made their way to the Minutemen position. Together they set about freeing the captives and destroying the automated gun turrets in the town. As the sun rose, a mixed force of trappers and gunners formed up just west of the town to overrun the Commonwealth positions. Minutemen artillery began raining down on the edge of the town. Using this as cover, a fleet of vertibirds arrived overhead to evacuate the stranded troops and captives. Minutemen artillery then rained down on the town and the stranded boats. The threat posed by the pirate fleet ended. 9 Commonwealth Medals of Valor would be earned by the raiding force. 3 of those medals were posthumous awards for the crew of the Iris. For conspicuous gallantry under fire, news of the raid spread throughout the wasteland and many were impressed. Even the Brotherhood reluctantly praised the Minutemen. High Elder Maxon remarked that it was the bravest damn thing he'd ever heard of. In view of their feat at Southwest Harbor, Congress passed a bill calling for the 7th Transport Detachment to be reformed as the Commonwealth Navy, a separate military branch on April 29, 2292. After a lot of persuasion, representatives from Diamond City, Bunker Hill, Good Neighbor, Vault 81, and Sanctuary Hills met in Good Neighbor in late November to discuss the formation of a defense pact. Elder Maxon of the Brotherhood of Steel was also coaxed into attending as an observer. After several days, the discussions evolved from writing up a simple defensive pact to crafting a formal government. Many long and exhausting rounds of talks took place. Finally, the 5 settlements, with the approval of the Brotherhood, unveiled plans to re-establish a government for the Commonwealth region on the 4th of December 2287. Minutemen traveled to the outlying settlements and farms spreading the news of the new Commonwealth and persuading others to join. Eventually 30 other settlements agreed to join the existing 5 settlements. The United Farms and Settlements of the Commonwealth, or the Commonwealth, was formally established on the 28th of December 2287. The most infamous of these judges was Judge George Parker, the hanging judge. Having survived more than a dozen assassination attempts, he was known far and wide for being inflexibly honest and sometimes dealing out justice on the spot. He would sometimes accompany his marshals, Jack Bass, and Gentleman Jim Talbot in their travels across the Commonwealth border to retrieve criminals hiding in raider territory. For the first generation, sacrifice and death. For the second generation, hardship and struggle. For the third generation, bread. Excerpt from the Settler's Song. One of the more significant projects undertaken at this time was Project Phoenix. When the Minutemen entered the Boston Public Library, they found the bodies of Curator Givens and the rest of his team. Givens had been trying to preserve the contents of the library by copying books into digital format. Unfortunately, they were all killed when super mutants broke in. Both the Commonwealth and the Brotherhood realized the immense value of this work and negotiated a treaty to continue the project and share the knowledge. Under Project Phoenix, the Brotherhood would assist in copying books and would receive a digital copy in exchange for sharing books from the Library of Congress facility in the capital wasteland. In addition, scavengers were paid for bringing in books and technical documents from the wasteland. Besides the immense trove of technical data, many works of literature were saved for future generations to enjoy. Copies of the books saved at the Boston Public Library would one day make up the core of the Commonwealth University Library. A lone vertibird flies over Lake Champlain in northern Vermont at treetop level. Inside is the first squad of the 2nd Minutemen Scouts. Pilots from the 8th Air Lance have trained for 6 months for this nighttime mission. They successfully navigate the lake and land 5 miles south of Burlington, Vermont. The Scouts set up a radio beacon to lead in the rest of the 8th Air Lance and drop the 6th and 9th Minutemen companies far behind enemy lines. To her horror, the technician finds that the radio beacon is not working. One of the vacuum tubes inside the beacon has broken during the long flight. She manages to get the beacon working using spare parts and narrowly avoids disaster. This will be the first of several errors, mistakes, and bad luck that will haunt this operation. This is the beginning of Operation Shining Beacon, and the start of the Commonwealth's 10-year-long conflict in the New Hampshire region. All he can do is spare one platoon from the 13th Minutemen to try and break through to the surrounded troops. The commander of the 13th, Lieutenant John Pears, takes one platoon and force marches his way west. The Rutland militia detects this force of Minutemen headed west. Elijah Allen leaves a small force surrounding Rutland and takes most of his forces to intercept the relief column. The platoon makes it as far as Keene, New Hampshire, where they are surrounded. For 3 days the platoon fights off repeated attacks of up to 200 militiamen. Vertibirds use the pause in the fighting around Rutland to airdrop supplies to the 11th. Over the course of the fight, most of the platoon is killed, including Lieutenant Pears. The last 5 Minutemen exhaust their ammunition and decide to make a final bayonet charge at the militiamen. Elijah Allen, impressed by their bravery, asks for a ceasefire. He allows the survivors to return to Manchester with the body of Lieutenant Pears. Although they failed to lift the siege at Rutland, the platoon relieved the pressure on the 11th, long enough for them to get resupplied by vertibirds. This single engagement would change the reputation of the 13th Minuteman Company. From being a punishment unit to being one of the toughest units in the Minutemen.
In the super mutant camp they gathered, training with a common purpose. Old rivalries now forgotten. All the distant tribes gathered. Californians with Appalachians. Commonwealth with Mojave. All dreaming of one last war. A war to kill the humans out of the Commonwealth. A war to turn the rubble of this land into a new homeland for supermutants. A war to bring about the age of the supermutant.